Hi, this is Katey DeCelle with Minnesota Capitol News, reporting here from the Capitol with Green Party endorsed mayoral candidate Elizabeth Dickinson. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Katey.
Now, we'd like to know a little bit more about you and your platform, but can you first start by giving us some background? I know you went to Cambridge University. Can you tell us about your time there?
Sure. Well, my undergraduate degree is in education from Cambridge University in Cambridge, England. And I also have a master's degree in psychology from Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So my political background includes stints at the Minnesota AIDS Project as their community affairs manager, where I worked on trying to pass comprehensive sex education, try to getting more healthcare funding for people with HIV/AIDS, and also trying to get more funding for culturally appropriate African-born counseling and education.
Now, with your education, how do you see that helping you in this race, or if you are elected mayor?
My education background, because I was also a substitute teacher and a long-term substitute teacher in Massachusetts, I think it gives me a real empathy and understanding of how classrooms work. And although the school budget is obviously separate from the city budget in St. Paul, many people at the doors will ask, well, what's your stance on education? And I can tell you that I'm a big supporter of public education, and I especially know from my stint in the classrooms how important support staff is in helping teachers be successful, especially when classroom sizes get to be larger. I can tell you that when I was a teacher in Massachusetts, that the days that support staff were present to help with, kids who may have been deaf or kids who had English was a second language for them, that it went so much better when you had support staff there to help give that little extra bit so that you could concentrate on teaching as much as possible to the whole, and not get too distracted with, one student who needed really a lot of extra help. So I'm very empathetic to and sympathetic to making sure that the schools are fully funded so that that kind of support staff is really there to support the teachers and the work they do. I'm also a big proponent of the restorative justice programs in the schools. I toured several schools, from the little ones to the big ones, and it is making such a difference in terms of how discipline works in a school, giving kids a sense of agency. As you may know, it's based on this idea of indigenous circles, where kids sit in a circle and each gets a chance to hold a talking stick and talk about how they're going to face challenges. With little kids, it's establishing what I think of as emotional literacy, where the little kids are asked, what made you happy today? What made you sad? What made you angry? What can you do about it? And at the higher levels, it really does allow kids to solve their own challenges and difficulties in school. One of the schools I went to actually said that it reduced referrals to the extent that there were 239 fewer referrals, and that means, referring kids out of the classroom to principal or whatever. And I think that's tremendous. We only have it in 6 schools. We're going to get it in 3 more next year, and it's something that I think should be expanded throughout the entire district.
And the restorative justice program, it is going to be expanded with more funds that are coming through the school system. How do you propose to get more funds through the school systems?
Well, the school system, as I said, is a separate budget from the city budget. But I know that there is funding that's always possible from going to foundations, to get extra help from there. So that's something to be looked at, because I think once you establish, I know because I've written grants for nonprofits, once you establish relationships with foundations, they start to become a lot more empathetic and open to the types of work that you're doing. And places like the Kresge and McKnight those are all places where I would go to see if we can get more funding to expand it.
Great. I'm just curious, do you know off the top of your head what the schools are that have the restorative justice program here?
We've got Johnson, Farnsworth, and there's one of the elementary schools on the west side.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're a West Side resident, correct?
I'm a west side resident. Yes, I am.
How long have you lived there?
18 years.
Oh, wow. What's your favorite thing about the West Side?
My favorite thing about the West Side, I think it's probably the diversity of it. It's considered to be the most economically and ethnically diverse neighborhood in the city. And one of the things that I think people are really proud of on the West Side, I've heard this said to me a lot, is that particularly in the schools, the kids from different ethnicities and backgrounds don't isolate into cliques, that they really interact, so that, if you're looking at a cheerleading team or a sports team, it's really truly integrated and everybody kind of gets along. And I think that that's really important. I think that's a great model.
There's a proposed tax increase in St. Paul for 24%. How would you deal with that?
Well, I went to the mayor's budget address on that, and what really happened is that a lot of assessments and fees, the right-of-way assessments, many of which were determined to be unconstitutional by or not allowed by the Supreme Court. And the city had to figure out a way to deal with that. And so what they did was they took a lot of those fees and assessments, which were assessed separately, and they've put them back into the general fund and back under the general property tax levy. So while it looks like it's a ginormous increase, it's really just shifting all of the money back to where it came from in the first place. Back in the early 2000s or something, they had taken all of these assessments out of the general property tax. And of course, it made it look like property taxes were going down, but that isn't really what happened. They just shifted it around as a kind of shell game. And so now it's kind of come back home where I think it probably should have been from the very beginning to avoid this kind of problem. There is a 4.9% increase, which is for inflation, and that is where the true, raising of taxes has happened. So I think everybody needs to understand, obviously there's a huge amount of sticker shock around this because it looks like, holy mackerel, but most people are going to see their assessments go down. And in fact, they've tried to do their best to weight it so that lower income people are going to feel it, that some of their property taxes might in fact go down. And obviously people who live in larger houses and, larger property, some of them it's going to go up more significantly. I do understand, I really do. I've door-knocked enough people that, a lot of people are very upset, particularly seniors on fixed income and that kind of thing. And I do think going forward that we need to find mechanisms to try and hold down property taxes, which is obviously a very regressive tax compared to income tax or sales tax, but it's one of the few mechanisms that city government has, besides LGA, local government aid, as a way of paying for things. But one of the things that I've been thinking about, because I do talk to a lot of seniors who are afraid of being thrown out of their homes because of being unable to pay their property taxes, I would like to explore the idea of freezing property taxes for people when they hit retirement. Freezing them at the level that they are, and then at the point at which either they pass on or the house gets sold, to then recover the difference between what they are paying and what they would have been paying if they'd gone up the same rate as everybody else, and seeing if you can get that from the equity in the house when the house is sold. Because I know that's a delaying tactic, but it does mean that anybody who's on a fixed income, who's of retirement age, would not have to worry about increases every year as long as they're living in the home. That's one of the things that I've been thinking about exploring. So,
thank you. Yeah. There are quite a few candidates for St. Paul mayor this year. What differentiates you from all the other candidates?
Well, I would probably say at a policy level, that probably my prioritizing of energy and the environment really differentiates me. It's one of my top 3 priorities. I've come up with some programs such as solar on the schools. All the details are on my website. How we might solar panels on the schools, and all the details are there in terms of how much money it might cost. how much money it would save, that type of thing. I also think that we should be doing a lot of outreach to the renewable energy industry, because according to Fortune magazine, it is growing 12% faster than any other business in the country. We do have some solar installers here. We do have a wind gearbox manufacturer here. But we've got space out on the east side where land is zoned industrial, where Whirlpool left, where 3M left. And we could use the jobs. I think it would shore up some of our manufacturing jobs. And I'd love to work with the St. Paul Port Authority, which is pretty good at getting industry to move here, to see, to strategize on how we might do that without TIF, tax increment financing, because that's the up-and-coming industry as far as I'm concerned. I'm on both the state and the national board for Clean Water Action, and I'm also on the board of a little nonprofit called Community Power Minnesota. Clean Water Action, as you can imagine, works on water policy, and Community Power Minnesota works on clean, affordable, reliable, local, and equitable energy. And one of the ways they are doing that is through promoting community solar gardens, and also working on things like inclusive financing, which is a way for low-income renters who are individually metered to be able to get energy efficiency measures into their home without going through the landlord. We're very active on the Minneapolis side of the river, particularly with the Climate Action Plan and the Energy Vision Action Committee, which is the Climate Action Plan. We have in Minneapolis, one of the first in the nation agreements between a utility, CenterPoint and Xcel Energy, and a city to work on their climate action goals. It's actually, there isn't any other one in the country that does that. And so that's some of the very exciting work that's being done on that side of the river that I'd like to see replicated on this side of the river. As I said, I was Community Affairs Manager at the Minnesota AIDS Project. I worked on Becky Laurie's campaign for governor as senior staff. I worked for the Association for Non-Smokers, helping pass the indoor smoking ban for bars and restaurants. And I was also a lobbyist and advocate for Healthy Legacy, trying to get toxic chemicals out of consumer products like BPA out of baby bottles, a pesticide right to know bill, and toxic flame retardants out of electronics. And I also worked for the National PTA, the Parent Teacher Association, here in Georgia and in Washington State, helping parents become advocates for higher educational standards through the Common Core state standards. So I actually have a very wide and deep political background, and I don't know that everybody knows that. I also worked on my district council, which is a local elected position. I know pretty much everybody in the St. Paul delegation, the state senators and the reps, and I know most of the city council and have a lot of ties there as well. So I actually feel very comfortable in terms of my grasp of politics and how things work in the city.
And you ran for city council at one point, correct?
I did. Back in '03, I ran. I got eliminated in the primary. I was essentially third after Dave Thune and Christine Nelson. And then in 2005, I ran for mayor. I got in pretty late to the race. I think I got in like one of the last days of June. I was outspent by Randy Kelly, I think 20-1. And I still in the primary got almost 20% of the vote. And in a three-way primary, he only got about 27% of the vote. So,
what are you doing differently this campaign that you didn't do in 2005?
Started earlier. That's probably the main thing, starting in early February. I think I announced February 3rd. And with the amount of time that you have, there's more time to do outreach, there's more time to meet with people. I met with well over 100 people over the winter and spring, doing intensive one-on-ones, listening to people about changes they'd like to see in the city, what their hopes and dreams for the city are. There's time to go to all of the numerous, oh my goodness, I think we've had between screenings and between candidate forums between about February and June, there had to have been at least a dozen. And so that exposes you a lot more to the public. And obviously, starting door knocking earlier. My team and I have been out since mid-April door knocking. And I've talked to over 700 people so far at the doors, which represents thousands and thousands of doors knocked, because only about 20% of people are home on any given night.
What have you heard is one of the main concerns of residents when you've gone out door knocking?
It's pretty interesting because a lot of people aren't always thinking city politics. They're usually, especially earlier on, people were coming to the door miming, tearing their hair out over the nightly news, what's going on at the national level. One of the biggest changes, I'd say, from the last time I ran, when I was running also on an environmental platform, at least partly, people were kind of like, oh yeah, that's nice, but what else do you have? This time, people are like, no, energy and the environment, that's important. We're so glad to hear you talking about that. So that's really encouraging. I would say, I think probably police community relations are a big thing for people. And so I talk a lot with them about increasing training with the police for de-escalation, cultural competency, community policing, all of those types of things. People are really interested to know, one of the things that I've been talking about on the campaign trail is that we need to be looking at the feeder schools for the St. Paul Police Department, the criminal justice programs, because we've got a tremendous police chief in Todd Axtell, and one of the things that he's doing is helping pay for a whole group of students to go through a criminal justice program at Century College, and it's 55% kids of color, with the assumption that they're going to come on to the police department. But I went on to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive into the kinds of courses they're learning there. And there aren't as many of those courses about cultural competency or de-escalation as you would think that they would have. And I actually spoke with Deputy Paul Iovino, who does community engagement, about this. And he just thought it was a really great idea to start looking at some of these community colleges and feeder schools to make sure that the kinds of things that are being taught are actually the skills that we most need now. Because we're really asking our cops to be relationship experts, and that's not how they're trained. I mean, it's not that they don't get some of that, but if you go on the St. Paul Police Department and look at their CEUs, their continuing education credits, it's all about guns and riots and all of that kind of thing. Well, we need continuing education credits in de-escalation techniques. I spoke with, I think, a state trooper actually at a fair, and he said, we get brush-up courses every year and all of that stuff. We need them in the people skills every year as well. And I thought that that's a really great idea. As the chief said, less than 0.2% of the calls that police are called out for require force. So the vast majority of the kinds of things that they're being asked to deal with are usually domestic violence, or some other altercation, but it's not something that requires force. And so we need our police to be as emotionally intelligent and as possible to be able to deal with those situations. And I really think that with my background in mental health, that I have a particular standpoint and a particular commitment to that, which I think makes me strong and unique in the field.
Thank you. What is your motivation behind becoming mayor?
Well, the simple answer is that it was the most meaningful contribution that I thought I could make to a city and a people that I've come to love. That's the short answer. The larger answer is I really want to be a hands-on mayor. I like to say I don't want to be the mayor. This is not a stepping stone for me. I want to be your mayor. That's what I tell people. I want people to feel like they have, or that they could have, a personal relationship with me. That they see me in the stores and that they could come up to me and tell me what's on their heart and mind about what's going on in the city. More of a personal touch. And because I'm also a life coach, I'd like to see if we can bring more of a coaching culture to City Hall. one of the things I did when I was on the board of the International Coaching Federation was I helped start an award called the PRISM Award to recognize organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, that had created a coaching culture. And I really believe that when you listen to people and that when you guide people to follow their intuition about what the best steps are for them, which is a lot of what coaching is, that you help people become more productive. We know that employee engagement is one of the best predictors of productivity. And we know that if people are coached, that they become more engaged and more productive. And they found that actually the engagement level goes up by about 12% and productivity goes up by that amount. One of the things that I worked on while I was on the board was this program that we did with the Minnesota MAP for nonprofits, where we helped provide low-cost coaching to nonprofit leaders who are often the chief cook and bottle washer, as well as being the ED for any kind of organization. And I'd like to see if we could have a similar program like that at the city for city employees to help them do their best. You know, partly because it raises morale and partly because it makes them more able to help the citizens, which is the whole point. So that's part of what I mean by a coaching culture and bringing that kind of mental health background to City Hall.
What things that have you seen that current Mayor Chris Coleman has put in place that you would like to continue doing, and what things would you like to change?
Well, I was really heartened in the last budget proposal, again because of the mental health background, is that they are going to be getting some more mental health specialists into various precincts. I think that's incredibly important, you know, because of all the things I've already said. You know, I know that the librarians, I spoke to the head of library services, and one of the things they'd like to do is to get a social worker into some of the libraries. A lot of people, you know, who use the libraries just to get books out don't always realize that these are places where the community comes to find out other kinds of information. And there are things that have happened, like, you know, homeless families who are working, they have to park their kids somewhere after school. Will they go to the library? If they don't pick them up on time and the library's closing, what's the librarian to do? You know, having a social worker, a floating social worker among some of the libraries, I think could help with that. And because people who want to find information about healthcare or about jobs, that's where they go. You know, and while librarians are great at what they do, they're not social workers. They can't always connect people to the services that they need. So I think that's something that's really important to build on. You know, we've had a sustainability and environmental coordinator. Actually, when I ran in 2005, that was a part of my platform that Chris Coleman adopted. It wasn't originally in his platform. And we have Ann Hunt, who's a sustainability and environmental coordinator. I'd like to see that position, you know, empowered and expanded further, you know, because I think the city has been doing some great stuff, but I don't know that the spotlight has been on it. I don't actually know that people at a local level know how great some of the things that we've been doing are, including making a commitment to 25% of the municipally owned buildings getting solar panels. So I think shining a spotlight on that and just talking about it more is something that we can really build on. And also working with the St. Paul Port Authority to make sure businesses know about the wonderful programs they've got, like their Trillion BTU program, which has helped businesses in St. Paul, I think, save 500 billion BTUs a year. And they're working towards, you know, a full trillion. Making sure businesses know that those kinds of savings and that kind of help is out there. I think Madison Equities is saving $1 million a year in heating, cooling, and electrical costs because of, you know, the kinds of improvements they've been able to make. We need to talk about those. People need to know that there's some really hopeful stuff happening out there, as well as expand on it.
Some opponents might be critical because you have not held an elected office before. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. You know, some of the strengths that I bring to this I don't know if you're familiar with StrengthsFinder. Yes. My top strengths are strategic, achiever, empathy, positivity, and input, and empathy. I think all of those are my top strengths. I've been a community organizer. I have been a lobbyist. I have worked with people in power, to achieve important things, and worked with the grassroots to achieve important things. Those are all skills that, especially the policy experience and the community organizing experience, have direct application in being an elected leader. They really are. They really have an absolutely direct correlation to being successful. The other piece that I have that other candidates don't have, I believe, is a really deep understanding about active listening and how that actually affects people. One of the things that I found, especially at the doors, is that there are often people that are really upset about different things that the city has done, or taxes, or anything like that. Rather than getting defensive, self-defensive about any of that, usually I'm able to create this space, this non-judgmental space, to let people calm themselves down. And even people who disagree with me, from basic principles, will end up saying to me, I like you, you listen. I think that that is an absolutely critical skill right now, because the dialogue at the national level, well, there isn't much of a dialogue. There's a lot of shouting that's going on. And I think people really want their politicians, their candidates, their elected officials to be different. And I think my ability to form relationships with people, to be able to capitalize on their strengths, to magnify their strengths, and to utilize their strengths is something that's incredibly important right now. I am one of the only candidates who has gone to the pilot silent meetings that the Citizens League has had.
Can you explain what that is?
Sure. When this kind of kerfuffle happened over the right-of-way assessments, and then being shifted back onto the property taxes, and the sense that there was a hole in the budget. This idea came out of payment in lieu of taxes. Essentially, what it is asking for a voluntary contribution from tax-exempt organizations like nonprofits, Big Ed, Big Med, the large private colleges, the large hospitals. It's been tried in Boston, where they bring in about $32 million a year from asking for voluntary contributions. In other words, here are the property taxes that you would pay if you were paying taxes. What can you do to contribute? Because we are providing services to you. We're providing police, fire, snow plowing, all of those things. Anyway, the Citizens League was entrusted with looking at these programs and seeing if something like that could work here. Well, they've been meeting since the spring, and I've been to most of the meetings. One of the things that came through incredibly strongly from that, and the Citizens League Task Force is made up of for-profits, nonprofits, a whole range of folks, is that they feel that they don't have good relationship with the city. And so the thing that came very strongly through to me is that if we're going to ask them to do more, and we are going to ask them to do more, either through payments or through services, that we have to go back and create good relationships with them. We have to acknowledge them. We have to ask for what they have been doing in the community, because all of them have been doing things in the community, at least to some extent. We have to hold that up. We have to thank them before you ask them to do even more. And I think that that's one place where, unfortunately, the city has fallen down. And one of my strengths is not only have I been at those meetings, and they've all kind of gotten to know me, and they actually, at some point, I was allowed to speak to them, in a public setting. One of my strengths is as a relationship builder. I actually believe that there's this huge opportunity through asking them to do more, to actually rebrand ourselves as a city. We're called the most livable city in the country, but we haven't defined what that is. And we have huge amenities. We have natural amenities. We have 26 miles of Mississippi River frontage. That's more than any other city along the Mississippi. You know, we've got cultural amenities, you know, in the downtown. We've got Park Square Theater and the XL Center, and we've got Ordway. We've got all these wonderful things. We've got world-class medical facilities, and we've got world-class educational facilities and business facilities. I think if the mayor looks at the pilot-silent program as a way of establishing better relationships and rebranding the city to be more specific, that we can do a lot towards attracting more business and a more secure tax base for us. Because we know that for every dollar that's paid in taxes from a business, they only take about 87 cents in services, whereas what comes through residential property taxes, it's $1.17 in services that we give out. So we do need to build our tax base in the business sense. And I think we do that through rebranding and holding up all of these institutions as wonderful core foundation for who we are as a city.
We're going low on time here, so I want to get the last two questions in. You mentioned in your campaign in 2005 that you were outspent by your competitors.
Yep.
How is that compared to this election?
Well, I'm definitely doing more fundraising calls than I have in the past, and Women Winning endorsed me, and so they've been advising me and helping me to do some more of the phone calls. You know, we've got some fundraisers planned, especially in the fall. We're still, I don't believe viability is determined solely by money. It really is about getting your message out. And we've said from the very beginning, we're a grassroots campaign, you know, we're mostly volunteer driven, and we believe at a very deep level that having these personal relationships is going to be much more important than the deluge of mail that comes out at the end, or the robocalls that I know are already being employed by some of the candidates. You know, and what I hear at the doors, we'll see if this is borne out, but what I hear at the doors is that a lot of people have never seen a candidate in person at their door, and that means more to them. And we know statistically that the number one reason that anybody votes for a candidate is, number one, if they've met them, and number two is if they've met somebody who's met them. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's always been my key strategy. I've been really honest about that we would out-doorknock everybody around this. And, you know, touch wood, that's what will carry the day.
Okay, final question here before we run out of time. So who do you think is your biggest competitor, and what is one thing you respect about them and one thing about their campaign or their platform that you would do differently or you disagree with them on?
You know, I would say, let's see, I am guessing, I mean, there haven't been any polls out there, but I am guessing that it's Melvin Carter and Pat Harris who are probably the two most well-known candidates. Pat Harris is obviously known because he's a former city council person from one of the highest voter turnout wards in St. Paul, which is Ward 3. So he's got a base of people. I would say Melvin Carter, because he is well known partly because of his family. You know, he was obviously a city council person for, you know, a short time, a couple of years before he left. But because his mother is a county commissioner and because his father was a police chief, you know, there's kind of he's like the African-American political dynasty in town. So I would say those two are probably the two toughest ones. Melvin, I respect because he's got a really good heart. He's obviously got a ton of charisma, and he's young and energetic and all of that. And Pat, I respect, I think because of his financial background, and the fact is that he has contributed a lot. I mean, if you look at all of the things that he's done in office, you know, one of the things that I actually worked on, that he led the effort on, was the police INS separation ordinance that they're now calling sanctuary cities. And I know he took a lot of heat for that when he did that back in 2004. And I think he got threats. And I really respect that. You know, I think that really is deserving of respect. Well, Melvin is really young. I've got 20 years on Melvin. And and he's not very specific in a lot of what he talks about. And I think even his supporters would say that. I really try to be specific in some of the plans that I'm putting forward. What I've heard from other people talking about Melvin, sometimes they say he talks in platitudes, you know, platitudes and kind of big generalizations. So I think he could get more specific in what he says. I would say for Pat, Pat is probably the more conservative in this field, and I believe that the whole city has become more progressive overall, and so I don't know if he really fits in terms of the vision of where St. Paul is going. You know, and obviously we have never had a person of color in the mayor's race, and we've never had a woman. You know, and I think honestly, you know, being a white middle-aged man in this particular cycle is not necessarily considered to be a strength by the vast majority of people. No matter how good or how bad you are, I think people are looking for something different this time.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
This has been Katey DeCelle with Minnesota Capital News and Elizabeth Dickinson, Green Party endorsed mayoral candidate.